Okay, Renaissance architecture. Hey, do you notice where that is? Have you been there? Okay, we will come back to it. Okay, you can divide the Renaissance in roughly 3 parts. You have the early Renaissance, the high Renaissance, and towards the end there you have the Mannerism. You can combine this and say, okay, that's the Renaissance time. And key architects, because now we're talking about architecture, and there's a lot to say about the Renaissance, with just literature, philosophy, and paintings, and so on. So we are choosing architecture, and I would just say a little, because it's so much to say, and so I just choose a little for you. So you can maybe have a more, when you walk around in the city, you can recognize, hey, I recognize that one, and yeah, that is typical Renaissance, and maybe you can figure out those things. So that is my goal for you, that you can, when you walk the streets of Florence, you can, hey, Renaissance. Okay? I'll just say quickly about some of them. I will say a little about Brunelleschi and Alberti, and Bramante, and Palladio, some about Michelangelo. And many of these people, they combined, they were sculptors, did sculpturing, painting, and then they went into architecture. And few of them, started out just like architects. They developed, and most of them went to Rome, because that was the key thing at that time. So roughly here, Renaissance architects, they placed the emphasis on beauty. I think that was the kind of the overall big thing that they concluded with, beauty. It has to be beauty. And it came all the way from this guy, Vitruvius. So beauty, symmetry, rationality, order, harmony, and proportion, geometry, regularity of parts. And they all use this as it was in antiquity. So, I mean, the Renaissance was just a reconnection. They kind of reconnected back to antiquity, especially in Rome. So, the buildings of the early Renaissance in Florence, where you are now, expressed a new sense of light, clarity, and spaciousness that reflected the enlightenment and clarity in mind, glorified by the philosophy of humanism. And as you probably know, the Renaissance, and the humanism was the kind of the big thing, So you will see that a little later. In architecture, it's always a vocabulary. You have your glossary. This is the language that we use. In the Renaissance, I've tried to put it all the way, on a line up there, so you can follow. So from now on, it goes on all the slides, so you can say, yeah, okay, that's that. The semicircular arch, and this is also a copy from back in the Roman time. It's more like a bridge, right? The bridge it's a half circle, and is a major feature in all Roman architecture. You find it in the aqueducts and all over. So colonnade, you find that in Florence a lot, especially in Brunelleschi's, the Innocenti. You see that long line with columns. You have the Bart Vault. It's more like a arch that you just continue. It would be more like a tunnel. There's a lot of those. And then the engaged column. And that is something the Romans really used a lot, So they had the columns that was freestanding, and then they had the one that was engaged in the wall. So when you put it in the wall, it didn't necessarily bear the load above, but it was more for decoration and symbols. And here as well, the pediment, that you have different ones. You have the pointed, the curved, and the broken. If you walk the streets of Florence, you will see this a lot. It's a small reflection of a temple. So that's the purpose of it. You show it as small temples, and you see some of them are just pointed, and they will be like this, all the way. It becomes quite static when you do it, and then you have those that do every second. You have the curved, and you have the pointed, and then it starts to have movement, in the architecture. It's beautiful. Pilasters. There's rectangular columns. And you see on this one from Alberti, it's also a copy from the Colosseum in Rome. And of course, the hemisphere domes, like the one that Brunelleschi did. And there's a famous one in Florence. Have you climbed it? Have you been up there?
Yes.
I was up there the other day for the first time, and when I came out and you saw, this, it's so high up. I know Diana was like me, was like, whoa, okay, this is high up. It's wild. And I mean, you see the drawings and you can say, he got it, Brunelleschi, he got it, kind of how he figured out how to build it. But it's so enormously big, You could think that, okay, it should work, because on paper you can make it work. And if you calculate, it should stand there. But when you actually see how big it is, I can have empathy with those that said it would not work, because they were so skeptic. And you have the different masonry, and a lot of them are the rustication, and it's beautiful that they did it. It's rough, it's finer, and then it's fine. And they made it so it's really standing, kind of solid, with the rustication on the lower parts. It's beautiful. And all of this came from the orders. So Vitruvius, when he wrote the 10 books of architecture, he at that time it was all about the orders, of the columns and how it works. So you have the Tuscan, you have the Doric, the Ionic, the Corinthian, and the composite. Roughly said, in temples they use the Doric, the Ionic and the Tuscan for male temples, and the Corinthian especially for feminine. So if you have Venus, is a feminine, so they use the feminine. You can see it in Colosseum, especially. It starts with the Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and then you have Corinthian on top, pilasters that is just like placed straight on the wall. It's like here. This is decoration mainly, but it symbolizes. So what I did with Brunelleschi and Donatello, when they went to Rome early, they went and started to figure out, how did the Romans, build, what was the way of doing this, and that's what I came back with, So what was remaining there in Rome at that time? It was the Colosseum, of course. It was some temples, and it was the Pantheon. It's a beautiful temple. Today is a church. It was made as the temple for all gods, you know, they couldn't decide. So it was, okay, this one is for all. And you have the sphere, the perfect sphere. And I guess you know, but the Romans invented the concrete, so it's built with concrete. And a lot of those techniques got lost, you know, when Rome was destroyed in 400. And then they started to, you know, pick it up again. And the Renaissance was the explosion of it when they found the manuscripts of this book. They figured out, hey, this is how you do it. So when Brunelleschi came back from Rome at that time and got, you know, they have sent the word out for, you know, who can build a dome on top of the church. He figured it out, you know, how actually we could build. Inside the Pantheon is, you know, you have the hall in the center up there. It's beautiful. It has remained like that all this time. And you see that this is Palazzo Pitti. Can you see where they picked, you know, the inspiration from the ceiling? It goes straight back to the Pantheon. So, Vitruvius, when he wrote the 10 books of architecture, that was maybe the book that influences the most, you know, in the Renaissance, in addition to Greek philosophy. So his if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's actually good reading. It has some, if you're not into architecture, it has some boring details, but it's also really good fun reading how actually they were thinking at that time. And they were really smart people and clever. That's why, you know, Leonardo da Vinci made a Vitruvian man is out of this. And they started then the plans during the Renaissance, typically square and usually based on a module. And I guess you know the golden rectangle, and you will find that all over in buildings from the Renaissance because they picked it up again from Vitruvius. So he described it. He described he made this. All the proportion was from Vitruvius, and then Leonardo, he picked it up and he just made a drawing, you know, which is based on this one. So a kind of revolution started. So when you have have you been to the Pazzi Chapel here in Florence? It's a beautiful chapel. And you see both in plan and in section, it shows not so well here, but you see the golden rectangle, you see the squares is used all over. It's interesting if you go in. I had a video, but I couldn't transfer it. But you go in and you see the square, and it's all copied all over, and it's with marks in the floor. And everything is in symmetry. And that was the symmetry, how to use that. And with the golden section. You see it as well here with the Alberti. This we have been passing every day on the way to town. And you see how it's based on the same principles, with the symmetry, with the squares, and the circles. Of course, he added, because it was quite a lot of freedom, so he added this one, and it became so popular. You couldn't find that in the antiquity, so you were allowed to add things, of course. as well as here. You can see this over here, and you can combine that with how Colosseum was built. It's the same idea. It's the same idea. So the module, like, is more or less like, you know, modern architecture. If you go to skyscrapers, there's modules. You place them on top of each other. Same there. You started with a really rustic part down, and you go finer and finer, all the way up. So Brunelleschi, I guess you know the story, so I wouldn't use time on that. But he came up with this way of how to build a dome. At that time, it was not enough tree in Tuscany that he could build the scaffolding. So normally you would do that. You would, you know, build it up, and then you would start to do the dome, the hemisphere. But at that time, it wasn't enough. So he came up with this brilliant idea. I took this picture the other day on the way up, where he actually locked the bricks all the time, you know. So, because you could come up to a certain point, and then, you know, when you go here, you have, what is it, 43 meters in diameter, and then you come up here, and then, you know, you're working up here. It's just like, how far is it down? It's really steep, and then suddenly, you know, everything could collapse. But he locked it all the way with using this technique, and that was his secret. So, have you heard the story with the Colombi egg? Okay, so so he. They put it out like you know, a competition who could build, you know, the dome, and there was many that tried but couldn't do it, and of course they had so much suggestions, creative suggestions, how to actually, you know, since there was no wood to do the scaffolding, how they could do it. Even one had to fill it with dirt, you know, the whole church, and then, you know, build it up. So they suggested to put in some gold in the middle, you know, and then people could dig it out again, you know, just looking for the gold. And Brunelleschi at that time came back from Rome. He figured this out. This is the way we can do it. And he said, you know, I have the solution for it, but I don't want to tell it to you. And they didn't trust him. So he said, okay, if you can make this egg stand, I will reveal it for you. And of course they tried, they couldn't, you know, our egg would just fall, you know. And then he took and he peeled off, and he made it stand, because he just, you know, took parts of it off. And then the egg was standing. And I said, hey, we could do that as well. You know, it was not that difficult. And then he replied, you know, like, yeah, but you didn't. So, because he said, if you will see my drawings, you will easily figure out that it's possible to build it this way. So he did. And of course got famous for it. He also built the Innocenti. Elias and me were over there the other day. It's so beautiful. So with this colonnade, the Bart Vault, it's a beautiful building. He continued on it to a certain time, and then he left it over for his one of his co-workers. Brunelleschi was also the kind of inventor, even though it came from this, you know, because Vitruvius had already described how you can do a linear perspective. But Brunelleschi, he kind of discovered it, or he rediscovered it in 1420. And it's interesting for architects, you know, that from this time, the architects start to draw. So before this, you know, you build a model. So if you have seen cartoons, you know, of like the famous European Asterix, you know, about how the Roman Empire took over, it was always models, you know, for buildings. But from Brunelleschi, it's drawings. And you can see this drawing from him. So this is the Brunelleschi. 1434 Santo Spirito, and this is actually the picture from now. And you see, there is suddenly you can actually have a client and you can make a perspective, and you get a sense of space. Before that, you couldn't. You have to, you could do facades, and you made a model, but now you can make a perspective drawing. And that got to be so popular, it has lasted ever since. Yeah, Santa Maria Novella from Alberti, this one. So you see how he constructed the facade. Symmetry. And also Michelosso, made Palazzo Medici here in Florence. You see the same thing, the module. You're stacking, and you go rustica, and you go finer, and you're finer. And here's a typical example from Rome, 1517. And at this one, it was quite many architects that was involved in making this. And here you see the rhythm. You see this? This is pointed, it's round, it's pointed, it's round. You see how static it is up here? It's like just a copy. Da, 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 da. But here is movement all the time. So Michelangelo, he made this. Beautiful, hanging out, creating shadow, and he made this. And you see how it goes towards the center, the symmetry. I mean, in our company, symmetry is the no word, You always, avoid it, these days. It's, no, it got symmetrical. Let's, move it out. And that's it's quite funny, how that has changed. Bramante. This is probably the masterpiece of the Renaissance because it combines all the ideas that they had into one piece. So this is built on the place where St. Peter got killed. And I was there in February. Sadly, you can't get in because it's a So the only thing you can do is to stick your camera inside and take a picture. But it has its order, and it's kind of a copy from the Temple of Vesta in Rome already. But it's added the hemisphere and the dome on the top, what they don't have. So it's a combination. It's a new invention, and that's what I did. So they took parts that was from antiquity, and they redefined it a little, but they used the same order, especially with having the pilasters here. So this is a really typical Renaissance part. It has no function except decoration, actually, but it reflects and it brings you back to antiquity because that was what they did. They reconnected with antiquity, both the styles and the ambitions. And of this, you probably know with the Medici family was the big patrons for all these architects and for the painters and for the sculptors in Florence, and they feeded this movement, the Renaissance, for a long time. Especially Lorenzo the Magnificent, he pushed this and he feeded it. But they were so, what can we say? They were intentional. There wasn't like, yeah, here, you got 100,000 euros, make some fun art. No, they pointed and said, no, I want this, you know. I want you to build this. I want you to paint this. Because they wanted beauty. And you see that if you go in the Uffizi, you know, with Donatello, with all these great painters, that it was so, you know, they actually, instead of doing kind of the narrative church history, they started to go out of that, and they started to, you know, show beauty. You know, you have the birth of Venus. Is that the big one? You know, that is really a change. You know, when it comes to, you know, what they did, when it comes to paintings, because they took away parts of Christianity and they added in humanism. And they say, okay, it's wider. Part of it, I guess, is also because of at that time, the Catholic Church, you know, it had to come something, I guess, because it was so corrupt, part of the church, you know, that you could actually pay to get forgiveness of sins, right? So they sold it. And so I guess it came to a point where, you know, something had to happen with this. And then when Lorenzo de' Medici started to pick out Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, and then put these masters, you know, these geniuses to make art, then he could actually, you know, start a movement. And they did. So the Tempietto, small, what do you call it? Yeah, it's kind of a temple inside a monastery just outside the Vatican today. It's just on the top of a hill. It's probably the masterpiece because it combines everything, you know, both the way they did this was Peter, so it was not feminine, it was masculine, so they choose the order of the Tuscan order. So they could go on with a Corinthian order, but they would be wrong because this is a male. And you can, if you want to study it's so much to that Tempietto to discover. Later on, you had Palladio. Anyone heard of Palladio? So he lived outside Venice, and in that area, not in Tuscany, but in that area, he had such an influence. And still today, you know, even all the way into modernism in the 19th century, copied Palladio. So Palladio did the same, went back to Vitruvius, went back to antiquity, started to rediscover how you did the proportion. He was a mathematician as well, so it's you can see it, you know, it's so well planned, but it's totally symmetry on everything he is doing. But that was what they believed, you know, if it's perfect symmetry, you will relax. I don't know how that is in India, you know, is it the same? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Because in Norway these days, it's like, if you do that, you don't do it, basically. But at that time, they were thinking, you know, that, hey, this will bring peace, and beauty, because we are symmetrical, right? We learned that in the drawing class the other day, you know, just the eyes, how we are split it into, and it's quite, you know, beauty is often what we say is when it's symmetrical, right? So I get it, you know, but these days it's like, no, you don't do that. But it's so much to bring from it. And you see the Palladianism is spread all over, especially in the US. You know, you have all these monumental buildings, these big buildings that is directly referred to Palladio. And then lastly, you know, you have to say that with St. Peter in in Rome, of course, that was the big thing. And then I think maybe one new thing was the giant columns that Michelangelo developed, because this is not, in the antiquity. But now we are so late in the Renaissance, they had to move away a little from the strict Renaissance orders based on antiquity. So they started to develop new things. And one of those were the giant columns. And you see it as well here, connected into the wall. They don't bear anything. There's no load on them, but it's just directly on the wall. So what I wanted to do in Florence with the Medici family, and especially with Lorenzo, was kind of to educate. So they, in Rome, during the decadent time, before it collapsed, it was like they made nice private gardens. And outside the gardens, it was like just garbage, and it was like, they didn't care. So it was private, they cared so much about the private area, made them nice, and outside it was like, whatever, During the Renaissance, it flipped. So they wanted to educate the people. So the way they educated the people of Florence was to build the beautiful buildings, the nice buildings, not in the private gardens, but they moved it out to people so they could see the beauty. That was the kind of philosophy they had, the vision they had. They used art as education to illustrate, keys in both beauty, wisdom, and truth. That was the essence. So that about the Renaissance, I'm glad it happened. It educated Europe, and we built further on it. And today, of course, it looks different. But what I find interesting is that we can always go back to that time, or even further back to antiquity, to actually get inspired. How can we, as architects, or how can we, as painters, fine artists, bring the beauty out to people? How can we educate the people? How can we spread wisdom, truth, and beauty? That is the big question. So, 34 of 34. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.